ACR Convergence 2023 registration is now open. Join us from November 10th to the 15th, either in person in sunny San Diego, California, or online. With 5 options to choose from, you are sure to find a pass that fits your needs. Book now at rheumatology.org.
Welcome to ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology, where we have engaging conversations with leading rheumatology professionals on topics such as the latest research on rheumatic diseases, solutions for addressing practice management issues, legislative policies impacting patient care, and more. Here's your host.
Welcome back to another episode of ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology. I am your host, Dr. John Hausman. Show notes for this episode can be found at acronair.org. You can also find our previous episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on your favorite podcast app. Rheumatic diseases can be incredibly challenging to navigate, both physically and emotionally, not only for the patient, but also for their families. Patients often find themselves facing a whirlwind of questions, uncertainties, and unique needs. I always thought that as their rheumatologist, I could deliver all the support that patients needed, within my 20 or 40 minutes that I spend with them every couple of months. But of course, that's not at all true. In research that I've conducted in the past, I learned that many patients and their families actually reach out to these patient support organizations to receive additional help and to discuss issues that are typically not addressed in my clinic, such as, how to deal with insurance companies, schools and workplaces, managing the stressors of having a chronic disease, and many other important aspects of their care. And it is through these organizations that patients and their families are also able to interact with others who are going through similar experiences. And I think by doing so, they feel more supported and less alone. One of my mentors actually called this the, quote, alternative and complementary care to what we typically provide within the clinic space. In today's episode, we've invited Monique Gore-Massy, a patient with lupus who shares with us her initial struggles in receiving the diagnosis, her feelings of being overwhelmed with that diagnosis of lupus, and how she was able to overcome these challenges, not only to improve her own health, but eventually to become an advocate, a mentor, and a beacon of hope for many others. Today, we'll discuss the gaps within the healthcare system that patient organizations are trying to fill. We'll also discuss how these organizations can actually help us better care for our patients, how they help patients become empowered to better manage their own disease. We'll discuss how to contact these organizations and have suggestions for both patients and their providers on how to get involved. Monique is a distinguished and awarded global lupus advocate. She's a diversity, equity, and inclusion champion, a patient experience researcher, and patient opinion leader consultant. She wears a lot of roles. She's also a motivational speaker, a writer, and a strategist. She's the co-chair of the patient board and steering committee member of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance and has served on various roles within the Lupus Foundation of America, Lupus Research Alliance. She's a patient contributor to WebMD, a freelance blogger, has been on multiple pharma patient advisory boards, and has even worked with government campaigns for Democrat senators, including Senator Parker of New York and Senator Booker of New Jersey. She's an amazing person, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Monique, welcome to the show.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure in so many ways. Thank you.
No, thank you. So start me off with your patient journey and how you were able to find patient organizations along the way and what you personally got out of it.
Right. And thank you for asking me about my patient journey because I am a patient. I think some of us who partner with patient organizations and clinicians, we get lost in the shuffle because we might be patient researchers, etc. But I'm a patient, so I can definitely say that I am someone living with lupus. I'm someone living with fibromyalgia, vasculitis. I call it the itises sometimes, between pericarditis, lupus nephritis. I was given this torch and diagnosed back in 2010. And it took me about 2 years, 2.5 years to even hear the words, "you have lupus." It was a very harrowing and sometimes very dismal journey just to even get that diagnosis, Jonathan. And I was misdiagnosed several times. I live in New Jersey now, but I'm right outside of New York City, 30 minutes outside of Midtown. And at the time, I was working in Midtown and I was bouncing around from every single emergency room, the metropolis, pretty much like the headquarters of care, of medical care, global care. And I'm living in New York City and no one ever asked me, have you even heard of this disease, this rare disease called lupus? And it was detrimental to find out and also gratifying at the same time, right? Because I felt as if I was being gaslit so many different times when I would go to the emergency room, being dismissed, not being thoroughly vetted about what the complications were. And when I finally got that diagnosis, I'm like, okay, it's not just me. There are other people living with this. There are treatments that are out there. There are people that are living, but I also heard that there are people that succumb to the disease. So I finally had something to put with all of the symptoms that I had been experiencing, like really high fevers, joint pain, I was losing my vision. I lost my mobility for some time. And I say that because the person that is able to articulate now, or if you saw me walking or even driving, I was a shell of myself for like the first 5 years living with the disease and spending more time in the hospital, not able to enjoy the first years of my marriage. I was married 2 months after my
Oh
diagnosis.
my goodness.
And so my husband was pretty much taking care of me truly as a care partner right from out of the gate. My friends and family members had to shift in helping us in every single way. And whether it was taking me to appointments, helping me around the home, cleaning up after me, helping me get out of bed, the very basic things that we don't really think about sometimes when you think of a chronic illness. I was hit with it, like a ton of bricks.
And
So
tell me a little bit. I was interested in you saying that you sort of weren't, you felt like you weren't taken seriously over those 2 years. Of note, I was just thinking, I was in New York City training in medical school during that time. So hopefully I wasn't one of those people that dismissed you
okay, right?
during that time. But tell me a little bit, why you think it took you so long? Was it something about your symptoms, or is it something more about the healthcare system that was able to just dismiss you and send you home without a clear diagnosis?
Sure. Honestly, Jonathan, I wish I had the succinct answer, but I think it was a perfect storm of everything. I had already been someone who had been living with an autoimmune disease called eczema from the time I was like 3 months, right? So I was on a very heavy steroid regimen from before I could even talk. I had been in clinical trials from like 10 or 12 years old
Wow.
because the eczema was so egregious. And I had been very familiar with going to the doctor and having regular checkups and going for infusions and injections and blood work and all of that. So I was a fastidious patient when I arrived into the emergency room. And I think they thought because I probably asked the questions, I was on top of everything, like, okay, she's on top of it, blah, blah, blah. You're good to go. Like, here's something for the chest infection. It's not just a chest infection there. I have a pulmonary issue going on, right? My lungs are inflamed. But I think they just assumed because maybe I had familiarity with myself and my body that maybe I was a quote unquote compliant patient. And so she'll follow up with the next doctor, right? So we can release her. And I found that really, really often that I would go to the emergency room and very quickly be put through and very quickly released. And I'm like, there's something going on here. I was an athlete. So I also ran track and played softball professionally. I had a lot of sports injuries. So they were kind of like, oh, you've dislocated this, torn rotator cuff. It was kind of like attributing it to so many other things because I was able to describe it. But I don't think everyone mapped together and stitched together everything that was going on. So I think that being short-sighted and not really listening to the whole, all of the different pieces, that's definitely one thing that did not happen.
Yeah, that reminds me of that tale about the elephant, how there's blinded people touching the elephant and you could feel the trunk and say how it feels and the foot and the tusks, and nobody's able to sort of look at the whole thing. That's so interesting. All right, so eventually you get the diagnosis of
So
lupus.
yeah, and this leads me to how I even learned about a patient organization. I honestly, that was the first time I had even heard of such a thing, right? It's like, what that sounds like a superhero organization. But one of my doctors, she saw that I was having a really tough time. I was spending a lot of time, whether it was in the waiting rooms, going to different specialists, and she's like, you need help. Your family members need help just to kind of navigate all of these different specialists that you have to see and maybe prepare you for what's ahead, because no one really talked about how this was going to impact my livelihood, my family members, my sustainability to work, and my mental health. And I was introduced to, at the time, the Lupus Foundation of America and SLE, which is LRA right now. And the doctors told me about them, and my mom and dad started to ask a lot of questions in their circle of friends, and people kept talking about these organizations. And what I found initially, just between going to the walks, meeting with some of the folks, they provided support for myself, but also more importantly, Jonathan, for my family members, particularly my husband. Oftentimes our care partners, and people call them caregivers sometimes. I actually love the word care partners because I feel like we share the struggle with this lupus and rheumatic disease. And honestly, my husband needed the support, encouragement, and everything else that comes through working with a patient organization just as much as I did. I was on my husband's insurance at the time. I eventually came off of work. I went on disability, right? So he needed to be just as informed about what was happening as I was. And my family members and friends needed direction on options for better living or alternative, whether it's ways of diet and medication and outlets for physical activity. I learned that through patient organizations, and definitely means of advocacy and education that I just couldn't, there wasn't enough time in the doctor's office.
So, things like the LFA, how was your husband able to access that material? Is it that he went on the website, or he would receive newsletters, or did he get, engaged in some live groups, or how does it actually work?
All of that. So back in 2010, going into 2011, the websites were still something to be desired for, right? I think all of our websites and domains looked like something put together in a kindergarten class. But honestly, we were really impressed with what they did have available online, because oftentimes when you Googled what is lupus, you would get the most dire response coming through the portals. And so you're like, oof, okay, I have how many months to live, and this is what's going to happen to my mobility and my skin and everything else. And for him, seeing other people living, thriving, finding other outlets was really important. He would go to support groups with me sometimes. I think the most important thing that we did was go to a walk. The Lupus Foundation of America had a walk in May of 2011. It was the first time I'd ever done a walk with them. And for my brother, mom, dad, my husband to meet other family members and directly speak to them, share their woes, share their tears, share the light that can come as well, right? It was important for them to see those people face to face and hug them. Yes, getting the pamphlets were good, speaking to the other volunteers, but I think that human connection that they were able to make outside of the doctor's office, that was really important.
Yeah, I've participated in those walks with my family, and I think it's a really wonderful event for everybody involved. And it's interesting, there must be something about, hey, it's not just me and my family that has lupus. There's other people, other families like mine that are sort of have similar struggles. And maybe it makes you feel less alone.
That's it. It can be very isolating. And so I often encourage individuals to seek out patient organizations, even if you come from a family where you have the support, but many oftentimes people don't have that sort of backing. And it's really important to stay connected. It's really important to know that there are other means of living with this disease. And I can't say that enough, because sometimes we don't really, I know that in the clinical setting, we don't have enough time to talk about ways of thriving with the disease. But when you're connected with these patient organizations, that's when you really begin to see that actualize, and different programs that they're able to offer and that you yourself can become involved with as a patient.
I'm wondering, looking at the healthcare system overall, what are the sort of, where do you see the gaps that the patient organizations are trying to fill? Because, me as a medical provider, I'm like, there are no gaps.
There are
Like,
no gaps,
I'm
right?
giving you, no, I'm giving you hydroxychloroquine. I'm giving you your medications. I'm checking your labs. That's all you need, right? Or, or am I right?
Oh, how much time do we have? Honestly, it's amazing, because sometimes we don't realize that there is a gap until we're literally in the middle of it, right? It's like, I'm going through something and now I'm in this valley, and holy cow, I'm here right now. And you begin to realize where the deficiencies are. And I think we really need to be clear that there are gaps. Yes, there are gaps that have profound impacts on people like myself, like patients. And they're not in a very positive way. And I think we can't just say it in a very flippant way, like, oh, yes, there are gaps. And no, there really are. And they have a detriment to individuals, and sometimes even more so to marginalized and underrepresented groups. I've often sat in conferences, or I've been in doctors' offices, and you see the metrics about whether it's BIPOC groups and disenfranchised groups, and like what their outcomes are with certain diseases. And they're like, oh, and their worst outcomes. Can you imagine like someone like myself walking away like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that I have 5 years, 10 years? And so that means that, yeah, there really is a gap. And I've spoken with patients, and just being like involved in the community that has really come through working with patient organizations. I hear patients talk about the gap in accessing rheumatologists. There's a lack of specialty care, maybe where they might live. All of the patients don't live on the coast. And so there's a gap maybe in the location. There's a language barrier. There's a gap in how we as patients might even be covered by insurance or underinsured. And so there are huge co-pays, and there's a burden. And if you're on disability, and these are things also that patient organizations help you to actually kind of put a handle on, or help your family members get a grasp on. And then there's also the piece of, if you're a mom or a dad or your age, how you're able to make a living with the disease, the financial impact that comes along with it. And there's a discriminatory care. I think that that's really important to say. There is discriminatory care that we don't ask for. When we show up with these chronic illnesses, we also don't ask on top of that to be discriminated against, and additional biases. And so a lot of patients don't realize, again, that there are these very huge health disparities until you realize, like, wow, my sexual identity is affecting how people are talking to me, or what paperwork looks like, or my citizenship status, or where I live, and my economic ability is affecting the pharmacy and how I get my medication and can I afford it. And the standard of care, quote unquote, as you were talking about, that we think should be a standard, is not a standard for all of us. There's a trade-off. And so for me, those are some of the things I hear people talk about when we look at like what a gap is, especially in our rheumatic community. And obviously with the GRA COVID-19, we discussed a lot about this, even when it came down to collecting data, Jonathan. Like, we struggled with that, right? We struggled with getting information from certain demographics in certain locations, and actually having something like that to measure. And actually even the rheumatologists that were available, and some of them weren't rheumatologists, right? And so that's also a huge gap depending on the country that you live in, and the availability of resources, and the availability of one medication versus another in that country. My family is from the West Indies. My husband is from Trinidad. My mom and dad are from Antigua, and our other part of the family is from St. Croix. I know without a shadow of a doubt, Jonathan, when I travel to go visit my family back home, I can't stay too long. It's hot. There are probably 3 rheumatologists between Antigua. He goes between Jamaica sometimes and Trinidad. And in St. Croix, there's one who pretty much goes to Puerto Rico most of the time. I dare not travel when I have a flare, right? I dare not travel if there's a shortage of medication. Definitely didn't go there during the pandemic. So that's a huge, huge gap in care, not just for thinking of like from a very Western perspective, but we have to think from a global perspective because many of our patients represent such a very diasporic background. And so I think the disparity is so different from one group to another that you have to realize that there is a gap. And then I want to also say this when we think about the availability of not just the rheumatologists, but their backgrounds, the availability of BIPOC rheumatologists that can meet those individuals where they are, and then those corporations investing in the recruitment. Because we know that there's a shortage, but what are these very big conglomerates doing so that we can, from a systemic level, break that cycle?
Wow, Monique. Monique for president. So you've identified like so many gaps in our healthcare systems that have some of these like recently come to light with the COVID pandemic, health disparities. You've mentioned about the lack of rheumatologists. It surprised me that it took you 2 years to be diagnosed and you were in New York City, right? Which has probably some of the highest rheumatologists per capita of anywhere in the world,
Yeah.
and how, many states have few, no rheumatologists available. You've brought about disparities, between countries, and certainly the availability of rheumatologists and of medications in other developing countries is certainly lacking and something that we need to do something about. You've spoken about bias and patient involvement in research and how some marginalized groups are not given the opportunity and don't participate in research as much as they should. So all of these disparities are hugely problematic. And I believe we could talk about each one of them for a whole episode. But having brought these up, how do you think patient organizations can help to address some of these disparities? Like, where do they play their role, and how can they improve and advance our healthcare system so that we're able to cover some of these important gaps?
Yeah, I'm really glad that we are speaking about this. You're asking great questions, Jonathan, because I think patient organizations they're highlighting a lot of what we've already known. And they're also, I think I'll speak about this for myself. What I found is that even when I didn't have the strength or the fortitude or even the presence of mind because of maybe how my health was deteriorating at the time, patient organizations have the voice and the heartbeat of the patients. They can resound the loudest, even when I may not have the time. We have maybe 15 minutes when we get in front of you, if even after all of the electronic things that you have to input, we may not be able to get through to what are the social determinants of health that are affecting me even getting to this appointment. But you might be able to go onto the website for one of those organizations and see some of those things itemized because they've done a focus group or they've tapped in with patients. And so patients organizations can play a role because they're in such close communication with the patients regularly. They're in a communication with a diverse intersectionality of patients where you might not be, depending on where you're located or the language is spoken there. They have a really great network of specialists available to them. When I was pretty much, I call it in the dating phase of doctors, I constantly was going back to these organizations like, okay, right now I am on my fifth rheumatologist over the past 13 years, and I do not want to give him up. I absolutely love the rheumatologist that I have right now, Dr. Daruk Erkin with HSS, special shout out. When I was moving, that played a huge role into how am I going to get my care? It took me, however, this was life-saving for me, right? But I definitely sourced a lot of other specialists through the patient organizations that I've worked with. I know that they provide a unique perspective. They provide a truth that maybe I might not get, unfortunately, from some of the clinicians or industry partners because of whatever their ties are. And I think also that what I love about partnering with patient organizations, something that they can offer is they can offer you access to these other industry professionals. They can offer you access to partnering with whether it's CROs or bio or tech firms or being a volunteer, advocating or being an ambassador. Whereas maybe because of conflicts, hospitals and academia may not be able to, they can put you in touch with clinical trials that you may never ever hear of in your doctor's office. They're really kind of like the bedrock of where patients get their information, whether it's online in support groups. They're the bedrock of where patients find out about treatments, Jonathan. Unfortunately, you think, and I know you're fantastic from soup to nuts, right? But there's some of your counterparts who don't even know about some of the newest, let's say, lupus nephritis drugs that are out there or that are in the pipeline. And so the patients will go and say, hey, I've heard from X, Y, and Z org. I saw it posted on Instagram. Did you know that this is available, that I can take this MAB along with the hydroxychloroquine that I've been on for the past 15 years? Right. And the doctors, some of them are like, wow, okay. But I think that that's impressive. It shouldn't feel like you're combating against them. It should feel like you have a partner that's out there in proximity with the goals, the best goals of the patient.
Yeah. I'm just picturing myself in clinic with my next lupus patient or rheumatoid arthritis patient. How should I try to leverage patient organizations? Should I tell my patients, oh, you have lupus, contact the LFA? Or how do you think it best works for physicians to help our patients find these organizations?
Yes, I would definitely ask your patient, are you affiliated? Are you working with the patient organization? I highly recommend X, Y, and Z because we partner together. And I think that's one of the things you can say. They want to know that you have some sort of footing with them. And that also, it's important to you that wherever you might not be able to fill in that gap for them, that the organizations can. And so by recommending, you're also offering them a lifeline outside of the doctor's office. Again, like those organizations will help them navigate so many different things, social security, getting financial aid grants, things where we're thinking about health literacy and advocacy that there isn't enough time. But patient organizations really help educate patients about themselves. They help educate patients about the process and how to become vocal for themselves. And so I think, yes, refer them. But if you have information, tangible information, let them leave the office with that. But even more importantly, the care partners. It's important for those care partners, caregivers, for them to know, here's a resource for you. Let them know about the support groups. A lot of hospitals may not have the support groups, but I promise you, if you tell them that there are support groups, online support groups, you don't have to come out physically, there are virtual options, they would be so excited to find out about that. But also, a lot of industry partners have patient support programs and they partner with patient organizations. So it's really important, even if they've never heard of that pharma company. I think it's important for our clinicians to talk about the PSP programs and how they partner because they can help them with how to take their meds, benefits, risks, and even the financial component that, again, that you just don't have enough time to get into.
And it's such a great point that you mentioned again, is that this is not just for the patient, but is also for their families. So how do I find out, or how do I and patients find out about patient organizations? You mentioned the LFA. I'm sure for arthritis is the Arthritis Foundation. How about for less common diseases like scleroderma or some of the vasculitis? Are there other foundations that are available for some of those diseases? And how can you help patients make sure that it's something that it's sort of vetted and not some crazy internet fad that, they're going to cure their disease by having, a special shake that you have to pay only $100 per month for?
Yes, it's tricky, right? There's a lot of also information online, and sometimes even as clinicians, you're concerned about who your patients are partnering with online. And so like you said, Arthritis Foundation is really key, but I think you yourself, you're representing the ACR in this aspect. The American College of Rheumatology has a really great connection with these patient organizations. So one of the things that I actually encourage parents, care partners, I encourage them it might seem overwhelming. It might seem like it's just from the very science-driven perspective. But I encourage them to go to the American College of Rheumatology. Not only do they find out a lot more about like what the criterias are and lupus and research, but they can find out about the organizations that they themselves find qualified, that they themselves partner with from a patient perspective, but also from a clinical perspective. The LFA works with organizations outside of the lupus realm because, as you know, we span from one end of the gamut to the next. And so when we're thinking about organizations like LFA, LRA, Arthritis Foundation, Scleroderma, Spondylitis.org, there are organizations, they oftentimes will let you know who is an organization that they partner with. So I never want to like overwhelm patients and say, here are 5. Maybe you can just say, here are 2. And when you go onto their website, they will let you know who they partner with in those other areas of disease affected. Because it can be, honestly, Jonathan, the first few years, I was overwhelmed with contact this one, go here, go there. Is there just a one-stop shop? No, but one thing that helped me was when I found out about the ACR just going on there and even us, I think with what we did through the GRA, and I have to really again, tout everyone for that. We worked with hundreds of patients and so many different patient organizations, not just here nationally, but internationally. And so I think it's just important to maybe get tapped into 1 or 2, and then they're really great. I think they're a great resource for linking you to the others.
Got it. I think it's a great idea for physicians out there to just have a couple of these in mind when dealing with patients. Like I deal with patients with autoinflammatory diseases, and I know, Autoinflammatory Alliance, that's where I need to send my patients. So the ACR and then some of these like more disease specific organizations, especially if you deal with a lot of patients with some conditions, identifying and recommending patients to go to those organizations,
Yes.
I think are important.
I mean, as you know, like for us here in the US, we're dealing with ACR, but then there's EULAR, there's AFLAR. So I think that just make sure you're in touch with what's happening in your region. I know that a lot of patients from all over the globe look at, let's say, the LFA's website, but if there is something locally for you, like there is a juvenile idiopathic arthritis group in England, and then we have something here in the United States. My goodness, I'm drawing a blank right now. But my point is just make sure you're also in touch with the specialty care patient organizations where your demographics might land.
I love that. So let's say, I have lupus and I go to the LFA. How is it that patients get involved and what sort of roles can they play within those organizations? Like, do I just sign up for a newsletter? Do I browse on their website? What opportunities would you recommend that patients partake within these organizations?
I love this question. So you've already given some good ideas. They can be browse. You can definitely do things passive and at your own pace. One of the things that I always tell individuals that I meet when they're like, how did you get to this level in advocacy? I'm like, baby steps. Right. Literally, I am 13 years in, and the first few years, I couldn't move at this pace. I physically couldn't. I didn't have the mental health capacity. I did not have the wherewithal or even the fortitude sometimes. So if you passively would like to stroll on a website, stroll on that website, right? If you passively want to go to a walk and you don't want to walk the entire mile, you just want to be on the sideline, go ahead. Please honor yourself, honor what your capabilities are. The fact that you're even thinking about doing it, that's a lot. So thinking about getting involved, that's another step that you have to prepare yourself for. So you never want to say, compare, well, I'm not doing this and I'm not doing that. You're doing the very best that you can where you are. And we definitely want to honor that. If you choose to get involved as an ambassador, a volunteer, or even further as an advocate, for instance, on the LFA website, you have the opportunity to literally click the button. There are volunteer opportunity buttons where you can do let's say, fundraising. There's fundraising opportunities. They will give you ideas to fundraise at school, fundraise on your job, if that's your jam. There are opportunities if you would like to put together a walk or a bake sale. You can work in your comfort zone. There are opportunities if you'd like to do things from a legislative basis and write your Congress member or go down to DC, or in my case, go to Trenton or go to Albany, right? So there are things that you can do physically and there are things that you can do online. And I think what I like about patient organizations right now, the pandemic has really allowed organizations like this to meet patients where they are, whatever their capability is, whatever their ability physically is as well. And that's something we have to remember, because we're affected. These rheumatic diseases affect us in so many different ways. So just because we don't see someone physically out walking a walk, or let's say at a conference or at a speaking engagement, or physically working with a bio firm or on a focus group, that doesn't mean that they're not advocating. There's just different ways that they're doing it.
Love it. And what's the role of patient organizations within research studies? So you mentioned that some patients and some demographics may not have the opportunity to participate in research. How do patient organizations help people get involved in research studies?
They sure do. They sure do. I love this because this is where someone like myself, as a liaison with industry partners, this is where I remind them to partner with these patient organizations. Even if I, as myself, am never, ever interested in a clinical research project, from what we might know of, many patients think it's always going for quote unquote drug therapy. But there are surveys, right? There are so many different types of clinical research projects that patients don't know about. And this is where patient organizations do a really great job networking and connecting them. They help industry partners to identify patients that they may never, ever see or hear about, just because they're in our blind spots. A lot of times they might not be from the same educational background, ethnic background. We may never meet someone from the LGBTQIA community, but guess what? You need them in your research. And patient organizations have a pulse on actively engaging these individuals. I think what is also really great is that when we think about patient organizations, we sometimes don't realize how much they're involved in research. They fundraise, they work with some of the top scientists, some of the top doctors who help working with patients from ideation to scale of clinical research. And so in the same way we think about the pharma, bio firm working on it, the patient organizations themselves are working because they have those patients that they help to provide for those research opportunities. The patient organizations highlight patients as a patient stakeholder. I think that's also really important to be said, because nothing happens within healthcare without the patients as the stakeholder. They give the industry a better perspective on what's important to patients. And one way that they do that is actually bring the patient to them, or bring that provider to the patient.
Yeah, I think all of those points are absolutely so important. And the research aspect, I never actually realized that, of course, if you have a lupus study, where are you going to get your patients? Go to the LFA and they can help you network and get the word out about your research study. I think that's such an important concept. And it's also important, to move the needle forward in discovering those new therapies that you mentioned for like lupus nephritis, right? In order to do that, we need research. We need patients involved in research studies in order to advance science forward.
I think what's important there too, Jonathan, is that patient organizations properly arm these patients that are going to participate, right? So they arm them from an educational perspective, but also I think, and just really helping them to feel empowered, because we can't do this unless we feel hopeful as well. And so patients feel like I have ownership in this process. I have ownership in my health. I have ownership in what the future of what rheumatology looks like. And so patient organizations do a really great job, not saying that our providers don't, but patient organizations, they're really invested in doing that.
I love it. So we've spoken about a lot of gaps. How do you think, physicians, industry partners can engage patients, and also patient organizations? How can we engage patients and try to provide them better healthcare outcomes? What are steps 1, 2, 3 that I can do that my hospital can do that, you think would really move the needle forward in improving outcomes?
Again, time. How much time do we have? I think, if you needed to go back to your team today, Jonathan, I think one of the things that I would love for you to do is continue to find ways to measure what your success looks like as a physician. What does that look like? How does it appear? There's not a one size fits all. Does that mean actively engaging your patients and the patient organizations and providing follow ups in that active engagement? I can't tell you enough. People might say to me, are you interested in X, Y, and Z, even if it's a clinical trial? But do they continue to come back and continue to follow up with me on that? So actively engaging on studies, on information that you're coming across, on what matters to me, on my goals. Do you know my goals changed from the time that I was diagnosed from now until the time that I'm a woman, almost 50 years old? My goals have totally changed, right? So the outcome that I wanted 13 years ago is very different from the outcome that I would be looking for now. It's really important for you to continue to check in on that. So 13 years ago, you might have said, she is doing great, X, Y, and Z, but I think, can you reevaluate that? What does that measurement of success look like right now? I think it's important to keep listening and keep speaking to patients. So listening and speaking are two different things that we can probably do a whole other session on, but it's important to keep doing that. It's important to utilize the digital spaces that your patients and the patient organizations are using. Jump into a live, an Instagram live or Facebook live. What are they saying on the blogs? Don't snoop. You can put a few comments in, but engage those individuals, the people that you serve, the heart of the people that you serve. You really need to engage them outside of your office. And I think also find ways to engage them with you on a personable level. I think that also would be something I would ask for you to do.
I love it. Monique, I have 8 patients scheduled to see this afternoon. I'm telling you right now, I'm going to speak with all of them about patient organizations and how they can get involved and how they and their families can get involved. And like you said, get them engaged in their care. I think you're absolutely right. That will most definitely improve their outcomes. Monique, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I see now why you're called the lemonade maker. It's been wonderful. I really admire for everything that you've done and everything that you will continue to do. So keep up the great work and keep inspiring me and other physicians and patients out there to get involved, because I think if we all work together, I think we can definitely get to a better place. Monique, thanks again.
We can. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Well, there you have it. This episode really made me excited to help engage patients within patient support organizations and also to become involved in their advocacy as well. Thank you all for listening, downloading, subscribing to our show, and for rating us with 5 stars or however many stars you think we deserve. You can find our show notes for this episode at acronair.org, on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, and on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, please keep leveraging those patient support organizations, and of course, stay healthy.